right. So I have here an entirely empty directory. So the first thing I'm going to do is let's create our HTML page. And I'm also going to create a JavaScript file, and that's essentially going to be my app runner. I'm going to think about how I run my application. So I'm going to open this up in my editor. Let's have a look. Go away, all these things. All right. So empty HTML file. I'm going to create the body or the basic structure of my HTML page, head and body. I'm going to insert everything of my application into one element, and I'm going to give it a way to target this element and just give it a straightforward conventional ID of app. The idea is when I load my JavaScript, I'll target this element and load my HTML into it. So I need to require my JavaScript. So let's just call this app.js. What's in app.js? Well, let's just make sure it's loaded. And hello, February. So quick expectation in my head is like if I open my HTML page, I should be able to see that in the console. So let's just have a look. Hello, February. Everyone can see that? Cool. Okay. So I'm very straightforward at the moment. What do I want my my app runner to do? Well, if we think back to my browser, as soon as I open my HTML page, I want the app to load. So on load, create the app. That's what I want it to do. This file. So it's going to look something like. I want to listen to the load event and execute a block of code when that happens. What do I want it to do? Well, the last thing I want it to do is create the app. And we do that by updating the DOM. So I need an object that's responsible for it, and that's going to be my controller. So I'm going to do something like update the DOM. Something like that. But where does my controller come from? I haven't written any of these functions. I'm just trying to imagine what this is going to look like. So the point of this file is that it's going to listen to when the browser renders. It's going to load. It's going to run this block of code which asks my controller to update the DOM. So where do I get my controller from? Well, let's create it. Something like this. Well, I need to think about what is going on in here. So what do I want my controller to do? It's listening to submit events. So controller listens to submit events. And what does it need to do? Well, it takes the text from the submit event and creates a note, adds it to the list, and then updates the DOM. That's kind of what my controller should be doing. So in order to do that, I need to pass in a representation of the note so I can create instances of it. So let's pass in the whole model. And then I need to have the view that's responsible for the HTML. So I'm going to pass in this. So I'm going to create my controller with everything that it needs to do its work. So where do I get these things from? Well, let's create them. Note model. I don't need to use new yet because I'll do that inside my controller. So I'll just leave it as the actual object. So I'll create that in a second. This is responsible for understands what a note is. And I need a notes view. Var notes view. This, I'm going to start with just like an empty list. So I'm going to pass in an empty list of nodes. There's nothing in it. Handles, let's just call it understands the list of nodes and returns HTML string. That's essentially my definition of done. If I fill out all these pieces, I create my node view, I create my node model, I pass it into my controller, and then I update my my page. So let's go from the bottom up. Let's start here. And I'm going to create a notes controller file. I'm going to load it into my app. I am going to create a notes controller object that, as I indicate, I'm going to keep this on the right hand side so I can see what I'm doing. But I pass in a note model and a notes view. So note model and notes view. I store the state, so note model and the notes view. Okay. I want, when my page loads, or when my controller is instantiated, to set up those event listeners. And so I kind of want, when I create my controller, for it to run that setup. So I'm going to run a function from my constructor to just set up the submit event listener. So this is going to be run only once. I only want it to run once. When I use the new keyword, it uses this constructor. Set up the submit event listener. Okay, well, let's go ahead and define it. Let's have a look at our notes controller. And we know how to write methods on the constructor. Notes controller, prototype, and then I'm going to write a setup function. What I want this to do, set up an event listener for submit events. Okay, so window add event listener on the submit event and do something with that event. So I actually want to look at what the event is when I submit it. And what I want to happen when I click submit on my form, well, I want to stop the actual submission, because we know that we use forms to send requests. I don't want it to do its normal thing. I just want to use that event and then do something else with it. So I want to stop the actual event. And then I want to create a note. I then want to add the note into my list. And then I want to update the DOM with the view. Those are the steps that I need to happen when I click submit on the event. So my controller here is taking the things that it needs, the model, the note model, and the notes view. It's running a setup to create that listener for the submit event. And I'm writing the code at the moment to say, okay, when I submit my form, don't do its normal thing, create a note, add the note into my list, and then update with the actual view. So I create a note, and I'm going to create a new instance of this. And I'm going to pass in something. I need to pass in a text. I need to find at some point, how do I get from the event, that submit event when I click on the form, how do I get the information from that event, the text in that input field? We'll have a look at this in a second. So I want to be able to get some information from that event, create an instance of my note model, and then add that note into my list. So I have the notes view, which stores that list, and I'm just adding that note into it. And then I'm going to ask my controller to update the DOM. Now that I have the entire set of notes, I want to update the page. So let's define that function. I have it over here. When I create my app, I'm now using the same function here after I've set up to make sure that I update my page. So let's write that function. What does this do? Well, I have to grab the element, the app element, and insert HTML from the view. So let's do that. Document get element by ID app, and then set the inner HTML to equal the notes view, and whatever is the HTML from that. So I'm just asking this to give me back something, and the view is responsible for giving me back the HTML that it needs to. So once I've clicked on the submit button, I'll create an instance of note, I'll add it to my list, and then ask that list to give me back the HTML string and update my DOM. So things that I haven't done yet, I need to create my notes view. And it has an add method to add a note, and it has a render method. Cool. Let's finish it off. Notes view. Let's make sure it's also loaded here. I need to make sure my model is loaded and my view. So this is my notes, my view that I'll create just now. I have my controller and I have my app running. Notes view JS. Do I already have one? I already have one. Okay, so what is this responsible for? It's got both add a note and returning a string of HTML. So my function is a notes view that takes in a set of notes and we'll store it. And then I want to add two functions onto this object, notes view. One is the add method, which takes in a note and pushes the note into the note. Very straightforward. And I want to be able to return a string of HTML. So this is the main point of this object, the notes view object. So I want to return a string, and I want it to start off with the form that I want to input text and submit, and then loop through if there are any notes and grab the text and put it into HTML. So let's do it like this. So I have a form element, and I'm going to put it into an array with strings so I can sort of indent it how I like it, so it's going to look a little bit more visible. So that's my form, and this is my input. And the first one I need is a text box, and then I need a submit button. So that's my form. And then after my form, I want to loop through the current notes. So I want to be able to return an array of strings that are based on the text of the note wrapped in some element. So I'm going to loop through my notes and return, if it's going to be something like note.text, that's the property of the note object, but I want to return it as an element wrapped in it. So something like let's do it simple and just have a note text in a paragraph element. So I loop through it, return an array of strings. So I need to make sure if I have an array of strings that I join that array, and that this one is also joined up. So I just want to return a string. So there's a little bit, there's the pros and cons of using arrays for visibility or readability. If you use arrays of strings and you need to return a string, just join it at the end. So I have a form, and I loop through my notes and return. Okay, so let's have a look at where we're at. I think I'm missing one part here, which is the actual note itself. This I think is very straightforward. It's just a function that takes in some text and stores it. That's it. I can use new. It's got no behavior on it. It's just got a property of text which I access here. Keep it simple. Okay, so let's go through the set of actions that my application needs to go through. So the first one is it's going to add an event listener on the load event and then run some code. The things that it does is creates a note view, an empty note view. So it's got nothing inside of here. And then it's going to store this note model in a variable and then create my controller, which is where lots of the magic happens. When I use new, it runs through the constructor. So I pass in the two things it needs to do its work, the note model and notes view. Then it runs the setup for listening to the submit event. So it runs this bit of code here that sets up the submit action, which says don't submit the form, create a note model, but we haven't yet looked at exactly where that information is. We'll do that in a second. And add it to the notes view once you have, and then update your domain object model, which just grabs the element by the ID, it's hard-coded in here for the moment, and inserts the HTML into the property. So trying to replicate this structure of having the controller listening to events, asking what it needs from the model and the view to do some work. Given that we still don't know this part, let's log the event to see where the information is in the event. I never remember this part. So let's just log it out to see what is there. Let's run it and see what happens. Cool. So the first error that we get is an unexpected string on line 18. Let's go do some debugging. Unexpected string, line 18. So missing a comma. Yay. Okay, so it runs through, loads with no problem, and I have my input and submit fields that I've loaded from my render function. There are no notes. It's empty at the moment. There's nothing here. So let's have a look at where the text is of the string. So if I go hello February and submit, I can see here. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. I can see here I've logged the actual submit event, and I'm just going to try and find information in here that is the actual hello February. I want to see that text somewhere in here. I think it's something in this target. I remember it being around here. It's like, oh, here we are, value. So it's in the target property, in the first array input, and then the value. Let's have a look. Cool. Okay, so next error is uncaught type error. This note model is not a constructor. Looking at line 17 in my controller. Okay, so here's an interesting fact. On line 17, it says that it doesn't know what this main model is. And this is, if we think back to yesterday when we're trying to log out how this changes, this is no longer, this is dependent on the context that it's in. So the moment, and in order to make sure that we're looking at the property over here for this note model, I have to do something slightly different. The more functions you nest, the more you have to be careful about how this changes. So if I want to make sure I'm using the right value for this, I can store it in a variable. So whatever is the context here, I'm going to store it in self. Just a variable, I can call this anything that I want, and make sure I use it correctly. Because I'm inside of another function, the context of this has changed. That's pretty much it. Okay, let's think about what I did.